Yeah, because I want to continue this whole fructose situation and just kind of put that to rest as far as this idea that fructose is going to be causing fatty liver. So we talked through some of those main misconceptions and what's some of the problems with the research. And now I want to dig into what's actually happening instead of that, especially in humans, especially maybe relatively healthy or even some just average humans. What is happening with fructose and what is the evidence that we're seeing that it's not really going to cause fatty liver? And so, as we mentioned before, there's a few different pathways that the fructose can go through, and this is in the liver. For one, it'll be converted to energy. It'll be oxidized through the mitochondria used to produce ATP and CO2 so that the liver can function. And as I mentioned, that's a huge pathway because the liver requires a huge amount of energy, almost as much as our brains. And that's because it has so many functions as far as detoxification goes. And it detoxifies endotoxin is one of those things. And that's one of the main insults we have to deal with. So that's a huge piece. Another thing, or one of the other places it can be converted to, is glycogen, where it'll be converted to glycogen and stored in the liver. And our livers can store a pretty decent amount of glycogen, about 100 grams or so, depending on the situation. It can vary, but around that amount. And then it can also be converted to glucose or lactate, and then exported and converted or exported to the rest of the body, to the rest of the tissues, and used for fuel. And we talked about some of the problems with lactate production in the CO2 series, but that's not the same as this conversion to lactate and then that lactate being used as a fuel elsewhere. As far as if we take a muscle cell that's getting either glucose or lactate, if it's getting lactate, that's only one step away from being converted to pyruvate and then to acetyl CoA. So it's very close to just jumping right into the Krebs cycle. It doesn't actually require all the enzymatic processes that uh, glycolysis that are involved in glycolysis from glucose. So as a fuel, it's actually totally fine and a pretty efficient one. The problem is rather when you end up producing a lot of lactate in, for example, a muscle cell, that's a sign of derangement. It's a sign that things are not, or in any cell really, it's a sign that things are not being able to be converted farther down. So just to clarify that, this conversion to lactate and distribution is not really a problem. It's not the
Well, it's
same
not
as
the same.
producing
Yeah.
excessive amounts. Yeah. Well, I still don't see it as a problem. Uh, the
Well, I'm
conversion.
saying I'm agreeing with you. I'm just saying it's like
Okay. Okay.
if the muscle cell is producing lactate, it's because it's not doing oxidative phosphorylation. It's not
Right.
oxidizing to CO2, ATP, and water,
Hmm.
which or creating that in the process. It's just
Yeah.
going the
Yeah.
process. It's moving the substrate through lactate, whereas the liver is putting out lactate. It's a little different.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's studies showing where they like inject lactate or given lactate as a substrate, and that doesn't really cause much in the way of issues. So tends to be used pretty well. So that's some of the main effects of or main pathways for fructose. But in particular, the people, well, and then the last one too, of course, is it can be used to be converted into fat, and people will always say that that's the main route that it goes. And we talked about endotoxin and PUFA um, being major confounding factors there. But I wanted to go through a couple studies just showing how well fructose is used and how well it's stored. So there's one study where they were giving either a 30-gram dose or a 60-gram dose of fructose. And this was in people who are on the lower side as far as weight goes. The average was about 130 pounds. And between those two situations, the 30 grams and the 60 grams, there's no change in triglyceride production, fat production. And the same percentage was oxidized. So between 55 and 60% of that fructose was oxidized, which is it's pretty noteworthy for two reasons. One, if we're concerned about capacity for fructose, you would expect to see that there's a limit, right? That in this case, going from 30 to 60 grams, which is a very large dose, you would expect,
In one sitting, yeah.
yeah, and you would expect there to be a major difference in fat production. You would expect that, in the 30-gram dose, maybe 60% is oxidized, but in the 60-gram dose, maybe only, 30% or 40% is oxidized because you can't oxidize all the extra fructose. You can't handle it. And that's kind of the idea, but that's not at all what they were seeing here, where instead they were able to handle that fructose perfectly well. And it didn't increase increase triglycerides significantly between those two doses, whether it was 30 grams or 60 grams. So that's a pretty noteworthy one. Did you have anything to add in there?
No, go ahead.
Okay. And another one, this one they were doing, and also for reference too, like 30 grams of fructose. Normally we're getting that in the form of sugar that is glucose as well. So that would be like the equivalent of a soda and a half of if the soda's with cane sugar. Like that's the amount of fructose that like there would be 30 grams of fructose in like a soda and a half. And then for the 60 grams, it would be like 3 sodas worth of fructose. And
in one sitting at one
yeah,
time.
yeah. So it's a pretty big dose. We're not talking small doses here. In this next study, they doubled the carbohydrates. So these people went from having 324 grams of carbs a day to 648. And they also increased their fat. So they went from having 117 grams of fat today to 148 grams of fat a day. And they did this for 5 days. And during this time, their calories skyrocketed as well, of course. So they went from 2,723 calories a day to 4,550 calories a day. So we're just seeing basically huge overfeeding, most of it coming from carbs and some amount coming from fat. And these were not athletes. These were average people. Their average weight was 165 pounds. And when they were consuming when they were overfeeding, they were eating the almost 700 grams of carbs per day and the almost 150 grams of fat per day. They were only producing 5 grams of fat from the fructose. The amount of de novo lipogenesis in the liver was only 5 grams per day. And that's not nothing. I mean, it's not like you don't want to have that much, but I mean, 5 grams is like nothing compared to the amount that was taken in. And you're only looking at it at that time. Obviously, it seems like in these people, first off, they almost double. I mean, their calories went up by 1,800. So this is not something that would have been sustainable for them, but that they would have continued doing. And as soon as you go back down, you'd probably just oxidize, those few extra grams of fat that you had produced in the liver. So, I mean, that's huge. I mean, if the whole idea here is that all of this extra fructose that would be in the carbohydrates that you're consuming is going to increase fatty liver, then, I mean, it's just not at all what you're seeing in these studies. And then there's another one that was just looking at a review, and they had reported that about 1 to 5% of the fructose that's consumed gets converted to triglycerides through de novo lipogenesis. Yeah. Yeah. And they also pointed out that this amount of fat, like the 5 grams in the last one, tends to be only around 1% of the total amount of fat that you would typically consume in your diet. So yes, you're producing the small amount of fat from fructose, but the liver also picks up fatty acids. Like when you're eating fat, they can also be picked up by the liver, and they are picked up by the liver. And so if you're eating 100 grams of fat and producing 2 grams from fructose, like what is really is that really a concern? Is that really a problem? And how different is that from just picking up some fat that you were taking up? And what we're trying to get at here, or at least one of the things, is that A, we use fructose really well. It's not as simple as just eating fructose causes fatty liver. And B, it's the processes that are leading to the fat production that we'll talk about that are really where we want to be focused on. Because when our metabolism is deranged, it increases those things. And then we end up storing a lot more of the food that we're taking in, whether it's fats or carbs, and whether it's glucose or fructose. We'll end up storing a lot more of that as fat when these things are deranged.
So I just want to put something into perspective here. So there's 453 grams in a pound, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Or 450.
So something right around
454. Yeah. So yeah. It would take 90 days producing 5 grams of fat from your liver per day to increase fat by 1 pound.
Yeah. So the next thing I did want to talk about, so we talked about how well fructose gets used. It gets oxidized really well. We really don't produce much fat in our livers, even when we're having a lot of fructose. And then the other thing too is just how well we store it, which is just really, it's a lot more than people would expect. So there's this carbohydrate overfeeding study. I've referenced it once before, where it was with athletes. They glycogen depleted them by putting them on a lower carb diet and doing some workouts. And then they gave them between 750 and 1,000 grams of carbs per day. And what they found was that during this time, the athletes initially they were oxidizing about 400 grams of carbs, and it then, right at the beginning of this carbohydrate overfeeding, and then it increased to as much as 1,000 grams of carbs per day that were being oxidized. So that means that you are burning over 2 pounds, because 1,000 grams is a kilogram, which is like 2.2 pounds. So that means that these athletes were burning as fuel over 2 pounds of carbohydrates, which is insane. That's like a huge amount. And just and at some points too, it's worth mentioning that they were adapting in a way that they were burning more carbs at some points than the amount they were taking in. So they might have only been taking in 800 grams at the time, yet at some points they were burning more than that, which just shows our immense capacity for handling carbohydrates. So that's worth mentioning. Another thing too is that they found that de novo lipid synthesis, de novo lipogenesis, as a contributor to body fat production, didn't happen until the glycogen stores had at least 500 grams of carbohydrates. And they found that even after that point, there was more glycogen that was stored, up to around 800 to 1,000 grams of carbs stored as glycogen throughout the body, in the liver and in the muscles, which is also it's just pretty profound to see how much carbohydrate we can store. And that means that that's like carbohydrate above what you're using. So whatever's left over, we have an incredible capacity to store carbohydrate, and we really don't start converting much of it to fat if we're healthy until those stores are pretty well saturated, and we're really forcing a lot of overfeeding. Not to say that these people's diets were perfect anyway either, but and again, we've talked about this in the past, why overfeeding is really not a concern, in this regard, because when we're producing energy and using the food that we're taking in, well, it naturally turns off our hunger signals. That's the whole point of hunger in the first place. So way before this point, in someone who's metabolically healthy and eating a lot of food, they would not be continually hungry to the point where they could even eat that much.